Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Expodition. I'm David Greenwood, and today I'm speaking to a really talented filmmaker, Garrett Martin. Garrett not only directed and shot his film Unbounded, he stars in it too. The film follows a crew that barely know each other across the greater Patagonian Trail, the longest continual trail network in South America, in one of the most amazing places on the planet. What could go wrong? I'll let Garrett tell you more. Hello, Garrett. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well, thank you. Whereabouts in the world are you calling in from today?
I am in Asheville, North Carolina, so the east coast of the States.
Okay, and is that where you're permanently living at the moment?
Yes, it is. Yeah, I've been here for about 2 years now.
We're here today to speak about the great outdoors, and in particular, the Greater Patagonian Trail. Your brilliant documentary, Unbounded. I believe it was shot in 2016, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, 2016 into 2017, I think.
Yeah, so what was that? A 4 months, 5 month trip?
Yeah, it's 4 months.
And how does a trip like that come to fruition? We've all heard stories of Patagonia, and many of us have seen photos, but unfortunately haven't had the chance to visit. I mean, how do you go about planning a 4 or 5 month trip across the Greater Patagonia Trail?
Yeah, that's a good question. Probably don't have a short answer for that. But yeah, so it's hard because if it was just doing the expedition itself, it would have been one thing to plan for that. But on top of that, filming a documentary just made it 10 times more complicated because most adventure documentaries that you watch, there's a film crew following the actual expedition team. But the fact that we're doing all the filming ourselves just made it way more difficult because we had to figure out, not only what supplies do we need, but what camera equipment can we bring, how to resupply, and all of those logistical questions that complicate things.
Mm-hmm.
So it was about, I think, 4 or 5 months of just kind of like planning, figuring out how that's possible. But a lot of it, as you can see in the film, is just trial and error too, and just figuring out like how this works. Because we did consult with a few different adventure documentary filmmakers who have done kind of similar things, like Mile and a Half. Have you ever heard or seen that film?
Mm-hmm.
Got some
Yep.
consulting from them. But yeah, not much had been done like that before. So it involved a lot of detailed planning for sure. And we still messed up a ton. So I think there was just like only so much planning you can do for a trail that is undocumented as the Greater Patagonian Trail.
Right, exactly. And I think from my side, to make things even more complicated, at least watching the film, it was a team that were very green both to hiking, but also to each other. How did you come about assembling a team like that?
Yeah, that's also kind of a long story, but hopefully I can say it not complicatedly. Yeah, so that was part of the idea for the film, is to really get like a green crew that actually didn't know each other and were from completely different backgrounds. Because that's another thing that I feel like if you watch most adventure documentaries, it's a lot of people that have known each other for years and years. So my thought process was, what would it be like to get people from different countries, different perspectives, and put them on a really intense expedition and see how they grow together. So my last film followed a girl hitchhiking all the way across Canada from coast to coast. And ironically, Alyosha, the German traveler, was hitchhiking during the same time from the opposite side of the coast to coast. So we ended up crossing paths through a mutual friend, and he was super excited with the project and came on board. And then Robin, the British traveler, I met, I think, in Vancouver on like my last day in Canada, and I'd actually interviewed her for my previous film. And Alyosha had met her as well too. So it's just kind of like this tight backpacking community that like everyone kind of knows each other through mutual friends. And then Anthony is a bit of an odder element because we had another Canadian traveler that was supposed to be our wilderness guide. And 1 week prior to leaving, he actually had to back out of the trip because of health issues. So we had 1 week to either find someone else or wait a whole entire year to do the project. And by that time, we had flights booked, had been planning for 5 months, and there was no way I was waiting another year to do the trip. So Anthony had reached out to us, I think via like social media or something, and just like wanted to be involved in one way or another. And he had actually been to Patagonia before and had done a lot of hiking there. So we're like, sure, give it a shot. He's got wilderness experience. He's a guide. He knows the area. So he came on board literally at the last second, which was very surprising, obviously, coming on 1 to 2 weeks before we're actually leaving and having really no idea what he's getting into. But yeah, thankfully it ended up working out.
Yeah, he was from watching the film, he was to me, I would describe him as the father figure. At one point, there's a quote, and he said he didn't realize how green you guys were when he came into it. And from my point of view, I'm not sure the trip would have been able to make it without him. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's definitely a fair assessment. I mean, the combined wilderness experience between me, Robin, and Alyosha was so minimal. We all had a lot of traveling experience, but I don't think any of us, Alyosha maybe had been backpacking for like a weekend, but to go from like that to like 4 months is just like such a drastic difference. Like none of us had that, self-reliance in the wilderness for long periods of time, 1-2 weeks at a time. So yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment.
And navigation wise, you've already touched on it. It's a trail that isn't as well traveled as many of the other famous trails of the world. And I imagine it's not something you can put into your Garmin GPS and follow easily. In fact, there's parts of the film where you get lost. But when you're planning a trip like that, how much does that unknown weigh on your mind?
Yeah, well, it's definitely a lot of conversations with Jan Dudek, who's the creator of the trail and the one that actually founded it and connected all of the GPS coordinates. So we definitely went back and forth with him a lot just to figure out, what are the best parts of the trail? Where can we do? Where should we probably avoid? And figuring out what's the best route for us. But at the end of the day, we can only have so many conversations with him back and forth. And there's just so much information and so many unknowns that our perspective was much more, we're going to be prepared as we can, but we're going to throw ourselves into this and figure it out as we go. And there's definitely, as you can probably tell, a lot of figuring out that went along the way. But yeah, it was definitely a weird dynamic of like, how much can you actually know and prepare for going into the trip?
Yeah, and that's the beauty of a lot of trips, in that spontaneity. There's so much you can plan, and it's good from a safety angle to know where you're going or where you can be rescued even. But planning it down to every minute detail, it almost spoils the fun of the journey.
Yeah, definitely. It is a gray area, that I will say. There's definitely a line, and I feel like nobody really knows exactly where that line is too. Like, how much do you prepare and how much do you leave open, especially when you're going on expeditions that are, somewhat serious and life-threatening. So yeah, I think that's a line that we flirt with a lot throughout the film. We've definitely had a lot of people criticize us for sure on being like too green and going out there. I would disagree with that statement, but I understand where they're coming from because it is a really big gray area.
And you made it home. So without wanting to spoil the film, it was a success. And there's a great scene. It's about 10, 15 minutes in, and you talk about an alternate route. And as any backpacker or long distance hiker has probably experienced in the past, there's an alternate route that never quite goes to plan. And you start on the journey and it starts going wrong, and you realize you've taken a wrong turn, but you don't want to turn around because you think it can't get any worse than it already is. And then it gets worse and it gets worse, and you get past a point you can't turn back. And there were a few moments like that in the early sections of the film. And there was one particular scene where you had taken, I don't know if it was necessarily a wrong turn.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a lot. I think the one that you're talking about is right when we started the trip. And that's really where we were just in over our heads because we had so much camera equipment and so little food. And that moment was just like a pride point, because Anthony, our wilderness guide, had seen this kind of shortcut trail that went over this mountain. And it was a matter of, oh, the place we're going is right over this mountain. Here's somewhat of a trail. If we just take this, theoretically, we get to the town, which I think is a mistake a lot of backpackers make, because the alternative was, oh, we have to walk backwards where we came from, 20, 30 kilometers. And the fact that that was right when we started the trip, it's really just like a matter of like sucking your pride, because it's like, I do not want to backtrack right when I started. And just realizing, accepting failure, pretty much accepting that we were way in over our heads. And I think that was like a continuous problem of the trip, is like, when do you suck up your pride and turn around? And I think we always went up to like the furthest we could until like we turned back. But at least we had like that boundary in our minds of where that line is drawn. And I think that's definitely an important aspect of, especially this trail, but any expedition, is like, when do you draw that line and say, okay, this is life threatening now. Like, we may want to keep going forward, but at some point you just got to suck your pride and turn around. So that's definitely one of the challenges, especially on that trail.
Do you think the dynamics of the team had an impact of that, with everyone being new together and also fairly new to long distance hiking?
Yeah, definitely. Like for that, for example, we had started to go back towards town, and we were trying to find an alternate route, and Anthony was saying that we should take this shortcut, but I was saying that that seems like super sketchy. We probably shouldn't do that. But also, I'm not that well experienced. I probably shouldn't be making that call and kind of going over his head. So we ended up going with him. And in that situation, he ended up being wrong, because we had to turn around and it got pretty sketchy up that shortcut. So there's definitely a lot of weird dynamics there of like, who's in charge of what and who's going to make those types of decisions, because we really, just didn't know what we were doing.
Mm. And when you got lost and were walking through the bee's nest, and then you couldn't get down the ravine, was there a point where you thought, why did we embark on this journey?
Yeah, there's definitely two specific moments I can think of during that part of the trip. One was when we had to crawl over this massive log that basically went, I think, probably like a 50-foot drop, maybe higher than that. And
is that in the film?
Yeah, you can see us kind of like crawling across this log, and basically got like almost towards the end, and there was just a massive pile of ants that I think were like feasting on a dead tarantula on the log. And I hate ants and hate spiders way more. And there was just all of these ants like crawling up my leg. They were fire ants, so they were biting me, and I was just freaking out. And I can't remember if it's in the film or not, but I just remember saying like, okay, like I wanted to be uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable now. Like, I'm ready to go home. Like, this is enough. Like, I've reached my limit. I'm good now. I've gotten my fill.
So when you're in charge of getting the footage and you're in a situation like that, what's going through your mind? And you've also got other people, and you're wanting to get good shots, but at the same time, you're not wanting to take away from the trip. How does that balance play out?
Yeah, that's a really hard and tricky balance, because part of it is I want to get the footage. I need to get the footage. We only have one chance to get it, so I got to be filming most of the time. And then there is that other aspect of like, well, I'm in this right now. Like, I want to enjoy this and take this in as much as I can. And I don't want a camera in my face the whole entire time. And then there's also the other like producer angle, where it's like, I'm in charge like of this team. Like, I'm responsible somewhat for their lives, and I'm handling most of the logistics. So it's like also trying to balance those things as well too, is just constantly something that I struggled with throughout the whole entire trip. It was just like, it was too many jobs for one person for sure to handle throughout that.
And in Patagonia, it's a stunning place, and I'll let you talk about it. But it's also a challenging one, right? Both in the terrain and the conditions, the heat, the cold. I mean, at one point, you're talking about it raining and then it being 40 degrees outside and glaring sunshine. And again, at one point, Anthony points out, as the father figure of the group, that people either didn't bring or weren't wearing sun hats. How challenging did you find Patagonia and the trail itself? Was it what you were expecting?
No, definitely not. Way harder than I could have possibly imagined. I mean, I can't say that I've traveled that extensively, but I have to imagine it's one of the hardest places to hike in the world. It's just super gnarly terrain. And like you mentioned, there's just so many different extremes. Like I remember our first day of hiking, or our second day, I think it was like 80 degrees Fahrenheit outside. So like pretty hot. And then we climbed maybe like 1,000 feet or a few thousand feet in elevation and camped on top of this mountain and woke up in the morning to, 20 degrees Fahrenheit and there's snow everywhere. So just to like go with that extreme temperatures just in the span of one night it's so hard to prepare for that. It's just like two different extremes. And then you have all the different varying environments too. You have, sand, mud, water, ravines, temperate rainforest, super desolate, barren areas where there's just no trees for miles and miles. It's just like you can go from one environment to the other in just a snap second. And I think that takes its toll over the months.
And it's not just the landscape. One of the things that stood out to me about the film was the people and the communities you stumbled across on the way. It seemed to play a really important part, both of the documentary and the type of film you wanted to make.
I think we knew that the cultural aspect was going to be a big part of the film and the trip in general, but I didn't think we realized how big of an impact it was actually going to have on us. Like I remember, I think like 3/4 in the trip, one of the main parts of the film is we meet up the man named called Maximiliano and I believe his son and nephew. And when we got there, Maximiliano, the father, was actually in town. So it's just these two kids, I think maybe like 13, 12 years old. And they were just living out there in the woods just by themselves and running this ranch with, 60 sheep that are like herded on top of the mountain and like 4 horses that they're riding horseback on, like up these crazy ridges to go fetch the sheep and cooking dinner and getting all their food. And I think it was just astonishing to us. I remember Robin had a great quote in the film where she's like, yeah, back home, like most people that age, like don't even know like how to work a laundry, like a washing machine, drying machine. Right. And like these kids are like herding these sheep in like this super dangerous terrain and weather. And I think that was just like a really big lesson as far as self-sufficiency. And their hospitality was just incredible, just cooking for us, allowing a place to stay, being just so kind and gentle and sharing their life with us was just something that I personally had never experienced before on my travels.
And how was the food? That's always the question I have as a bit of a foodie when you're traveling to these places. How was the food?
Food was difficult, to be completely honest. I was pretty much a vegetarian, and Alyosha, I think, was a full vegetarian for the most part. And they eat a lot of meat for sure. They're called asados, the barbecues that they have. And I think we had 2 or 3 like out in the backcountry with families throughout the trip. And that was always an issue because it is, they're slaughtering, one of their sheep, which is a really big deal for them. And even the process of doing it is hours and hours. So that's this whole entire thing. And it's probably like one of the greatest signs of respect in Chile, like in the backcountry. So for them to do that for us and us to like not really eat meat that much, and that's vegetarianism is not really a concept that's understood as well down there. So it was always a weird dynamic because we didn't want to say no, but also like eating the meat would get us like somewhat sick. So the food is good though, I will say, especially if you're a meat eater, but because we weren't, it made things a bit more complicated, I think.
I can completely relate. So my brother recently married a Brazilian girl, and going out to dinner with them, I don't think I've ever seen quite as much meat as I've seen in a Brazilian restaurant anywhere else in the world. And speaking of the the landscape, and we talk about Patagonia being one of these really awe-inspiring places, and there is nowhere else in the world quite like it. But with that, it's an area rich in natural resources, and in parts of the film you touch on some of the problems both the people you came across on the journey and the areas you traveled through were experiencing. How did that impact on your trip?
It was something we were semi-aware of going into the expedition, and something that we wanted to highlight with the film. And it just grew more and more that we were on the trip, and the more and more that we interviewed people and how it affected their life. Water privatization is the main thing, just because companies can come in and basically just buy the rights to rivers and do whatever they want with them. One specific moment I'm thinking of is later in the trip. There's the Pueblo River, I think it's called. And you can see in the trip, we're going along this river, and we interviewed this tour guide. And basically, they just started building this dam and carving out this mountain and throwing all this sediment into the river. And they hadn't even gotten approval from the government yet, because typically they just go in there, start the project. And then once they try to get permission, they're like, well, we're already doing it, so you might as well just give us the permit. And luckily they stopped that one. But even just in that short stretch of the river that we pack-raft, the water was just this murky, brown, disgusting. And after 1 mile, you connect with the Pueblo River, and it's just the most pristine river you've ever seen, you know, that light blue glacial water. And to see like this murky brown water, like colliding with this light blue water, is just like so symbolic in so many different ways. But that's such a great example of, you know, what's happening in many parts of the country of Chile, is just these rivers that are getting destroyed and dammed, and, you know, destroying not only the ecosystems, but the livelihood of so many of these people, and especially, you know, the not Native Americans, but the Aboriginals in the area, the Pewenche people.
Yeah, how is it affecting them? What is the impact of these projects on these communities?
Yeah, well, a lot of different impacts for sure. I mean, their livelihood comes from the river. You know, if you want to talk just as far as food sources and things like that, it's devastating. But also on a more spiritual level, you know, there's grave sites, for example, where they bury their dead along these river, and they get dammed, and it just completely floods out the grave sites. And they have these spiritual areas that are extremely important, whether it's the mountain or a specific, you know, natural resource area that just gets destroyed by these dams coming in, because, you know, the companies don't care about that at all.
Yeah, it's we've spoken to a few other people who've traveled in the region on this podcast, and the story comes up time and time again. But lightening the mood, what was your favorite part of the trip?
Whew, that's tough to say.
You can have more than one. I'll give you two.
Okay. The main one that always sticks out in my mind is where the volcano is. It's called Puyehue National Park. I just never in my life had experienced anything even remotely close to that. I'd been to a few pretty unique places like Iceland and other ones like that are pretty like wild and remote, but that felt like an alien landscape. It felt like we had just gone on a spaceship to Mars, just because it was super desolate. You could see for I don't know how many miles of just this rock volcanic terrain of where these volcanoes used to be, and imploded and threw all this lava rock that just like molted into the landscape. And I just had never experienced anything like that before. You know, you're hiking above tree line and above these mountains, and just like seeing these volcanoes like splattered in the distance. And it was just surreal is the only way to describe it. So for me, that was definitely the climax.
So over 4 or 5 months, how does a trip play out? It's sometimes hard when you're watching a documentary, when there's obviously been quite a bit of post-production in order to make it a good film. How did those 4 or 5 months play out across the journey? Was it very much what we see in the film, or was there times as you're journeying where there is just stretches of nothingness, I guess?
I would say actually the film portrays the trail, the parts that we did of the trail, very accurately. Most of the sections that we did are included in the film in one way or another, I would say. What's not included in the film is the resupplies and staying in towns. And we decided to do that because including footage from the towns felt like taking the audience out of the natural landscape, and we wanted to keep people in that environment. So we decided to keep out when we went into do resupplies and went into these, hostels and supermarkets to collect food, to go back and do another section. So, I mean, that's half of the trip right there is just resupplies. It's not like we're on the trail for 4 months straight. So that part of the trip is definitely not included. And some crazy things certainly happened during those times that we would have liked to include, but yeah, can't have everything.
I can't let that one pass. Some crazy things definitely happened that we could have included.
Yeah, well, so one, for example, that we had in one of the cuts of the film, but ended up taking it out because it was too much and just too far out of left field, is probably about halfway through the trip. We ended up getting caught in the worst fires that Chile had seen in modern history. So we went into a town to resupply and ended up just getting surrounded by fires on all sides. We have footage of just smoke everywhere where the visibility is just so small you can hardly see in front of you. And that honestly was probably like 3 or 4 weeks. It was like a big chunk of the trip that we got isolated just in that one town. And we basically just made the decision just to shoot super far down south to get back on the trail and away from the fires. So that was a very significant thing that does not make it in the film at all.
And for those that haven't watched the film yet, we're talking about sections of trail here. And I'm conscious that some people might have in their mind a nice, flattened, pristine trail. And that's not the case. And Garrett, you know better than I do that that's not the case, right?
Yeah, I use trail very lightly. Trail is probably not an accurate term, to be honest. Because like when I say trail, I think of a government or an organization that manages a trail system, like the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest.
Signposts every 10 kilometers, right?
Yeah. There are no markers on this trail. You're going strictly by GPS and intuition for the most part.
So at the end of the trip, you're coming into the final stop, the final place. What thoughts are going through your head at that point?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think 3 months into it, I started to get to my breaking point just because I think mentally it was too much for me to handle. I think once you get to a certain point physically, you're like, oh, okay, I can just keep moving my feet and I can just keep going forward. But the mental aspect is so much more difficult to overcome. And I think just like handling all of the logistics and filming was just too overwhelming for me. So I think, to be honest, coming around the 3-4 month mark when we were concluding, I was just exhausted and was definitely reaching like the maximum that I could handle in a continuous stretch. So there was a lot of like mixed feelings of like, I kind of want to go home, but also like, this is incredible. And I know I'll never have an experience like this again. So it was kind of like this contradictory feelings of like wanting to stay and wanting to go, or wanting to stay. Yeah. Wanting to stay and wanting to go.
Yeah. And I imagine it's a quick shock to the system when you land back home and you open the door of your apartment or house and you're back to normal life. It can't just be a quick adjustment after all that time away.
Oh yeah, it was definitely odd. Yeah, we went from, being out in the woods and like trying to survive to me and Alyosha in this like just single house, just staying inside for, 12 hours straight in front of a computer, in front of like tons of Post-it notes, like trying to figure out the storyline of the film. So it was just like complete polar opposites.
I bet that first sleep felt good though, back in your own bed.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely.
And do you still keep in touch with the team?
Somewhat, yeah. I haven't heard from Robin or Anthony in a while. Me and Alyosha exchange messages probably like once a month or so, kind of back and forth. Robin, I know she is just a badass. Like she's been doing like long distance trails like by herself now and just like doing crazy expeditions. I think she did something in the UK, I want to say not too long ago. And now she's in Australia, I think. So yeah, occasionally, but not too much.
Mm. Garrett, it's been really, really good talking to you. For those who haven't seen Unbounded yet, it's a great film. And again, I'll include the links in the show notes to the podcast, but really a great film and a real pleasure to watch. So although it's a bit late, a couple of years after it's released, to be finally talking to you, I'm glad I stumbled across it, and a really good film that I can recommend. And thank you very much for taking the time to chat with me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
What a great adventure with a team of new friends coming together and embarking on a truly epic journey. Who wants to join me on the next flight out to Argentina or Chile? You can watch Unbounded now on Amazon Prime. Garrett has also shot a number of other documentaries that are well worth checking out. You can find them and his upcoming projects on garrettmartin.com. See you all in 2 weeks' time for the next adventure. Bye.